Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of the Yongnuo 35mm f1.8 art lens. Now, I want to preface this review by saying that I am disappointed in Yongnuo for, in my opinion, taking a step back in at least one area, even as they've taken a step forward in another. As far as taking a step back, I've been praising them the last couple of years because their recent designs were innovative, unique. They were their own intellectual property development. Whereas early on, my exposure to Yongnuo was that they were making clones of existing, Canon EF designs. And I remember probably 14 years ago that they came out with a clone of the EF 50mm f1.8. And so that was my kind of early impression. So when I revisited them over the last few years, I was happy to see that they were charting their own course. Using the art label, while there may not be a copyright issue that I'm aware of, that's obviously up to them, it does feel like a bit of stolen valor in that Sigma has worked very hard to take that art label and to cultivate it as being a unique representative of their optical performance. And they've been very successful with that. And it feels like Yongnuo is maybe trying to steal a bit of that thunder. And so I do want to decry that because I don't like that aspect of it. At the same time, I don't want that to overly prejudice my feeling of this lens itself, which does take some strides forward in some optical areas that have been deficiencies in previous Yongnuo lenses. This is an APS-C lens, 35mm f1.8. And so we're going to, that disclaimer aside, we are going to step in and take a look at the overall performance of this lens. Now let me start with a disclaimer. This lens was sent to me by Yongnuo for evaluation. They have had no input in my review, as you might expect from my intro here, and they will not see this review before it goes to the public. So now let's take a look at the build and the design here. This is a 35mm lens, but for APS-C. I'm reviewing it on Sony E-mount. I suspect there will also be at least Fujifilm X, potentially Nikon Z as well. And so 35mm with that 1.5 times crop factor on APS-C translates to a 52.5mm lens. And so essentially right on around the normal range, as we call it. The full name here is Yongnuo 35mm f1.8 SDA Art, and so S stands for Sony, and so in this case, Sony E-mount. Obviously, if it was a Fujifilm X mount, there would be an X there instead of an S, for example. DA is their way of referring to, not to Dustin Abbott, but to APS-C, and Art is, and I asked, this is the first of a new series of lenses that they are using the Art label, much like Sigma, to indicate a higher level of optical correction and also higher performance in general. Now, as far as the physical design, this is a longer lens than what I typically expect seeing from an APS-C 35mm f1.8. In fact, it is nearly 80 millimeters long, which is more than 25 millimeters longer than, for example, the Viltrox 35mm f1.7 Air. So that's a obviously very significant difference. And so 3.14 inches makes it a reasonably long lens for something like this. The diameter is far more typical. It's 63.5 millimeters, or about 2.5 inches, and it weighs in at 265 grams or 9.34 ounces. It's a little heavier than the Viltrox Air series, for example, which I'm using kind of as a benchmark here because it's a great little lens. The Viltrox weighs 170 grams, and so that means that this is about 95 grams heavier. Now, a big part of that is that rather than using plastics as used in the Viltrox lens, we have got basically all metals here in the barrel. It does feel like a nice construction, I will say on that point. 52mm front filter thread. The other thing that's interesting when you look at the front of the lens, something I've never seen before. Often there's different types of information that are given there, but this lens actually has not only the minimum focus distance, 35 centimeters, it also has the maximum magnification of 0.12 times, which is the first time in the hundreds and hundreds of lenses that I review that I have ever seen the maximum magnification put right on the lens in any way, but particularly right at the very front of the lens. Now, as beyond that, there really isn't much going on here in the feature department. It is a bare lens barrel, no switches, no aperture ring, nothing like that. All we've got is the manual focus ring. So, you would think, since that's the one thing on the lens barrel, that it would be like flawlessly executed, but at least in the copy I'm reviewing, though it is metal and it's nicely built, it feels like there's just a little bit of rub inside there, and so unfortunately, it doesn't move quite as smoothly as what I would like. It may loosen up with some wear over time, but right now it isn't fantastic. And so I also found that the overall throw here is it's distinctly non-linear, and so it seems to be really sensitive to speed, like particularly sensitive to speed. And so I actually found repeating focus pulls a little bit difficult because it just didn't seem all that predictable to me. So unfortunately, I don't love the manual focus lens or manual focus ring here and manual focus performance. So it's a good thing that the autofocus performance is pretty good. Inside there are 9 aperture blades, and so it does a pretty good job of keeping a spherical shape as you stop it down, but there is that kind of weird clipping at the bottom. At the side of the lens, fairly near the base, at the back, there is a USB-C port. It's covered with a little rubber gasket. I don't love these designs because I find these little gaskets, could be very easy to use. Now this one is easier to get out than some that I've used, but it also means that if it rubs on something and pulls in just the right way, it also could pull it out. And you wouldn't want to lose that because it would kind of impinge on the weather sealing of the lens. This does have some weather sealing. It has a gasket at the lens mount. It has a flooring coating on the front element. I'm not aware of there being any kind of internal seal, so that makes it a bit like Sigma's I-series lenses, for example, where you've got a gasket and some coating on the front, but you don't have any internal seals. But at least we do have some weather sealing, and of course the fact that this is internally focusing and there is no zoom means that there's not a whole lot of ingress points into the lens itself to get moisture or dust in there. So I think it'll probably hold up well in that regard. It does include a lens hood, and it's pretty decent here. It is plastic, but it is decent plastics. It's got some rigidity to it. It locks on in a nice, precise way, so no problem there. As noted, the materials here are nice. I will say that the design itself, because it's extra long, it feels like there's some empty space on the barrel that could at least use some branding to fill in there, almost like a space here where you could put like a tripod collar on there, and it feels like that could have been filled in with a little bit of something, like an aperture ring would have been nice, but nonetheless, it is a nicely built lens, but it is very simple. Now, when it comes to autofocus, it's unique here. Previous Yongnuo lenses I've been reviewing more recently, they always have DSM on there, which refers to digital stepping motor. In this case, there's no reference to the focus motor, and if I dig into the literature, it says it's an STM focus motor. So what's the difference between a digital stepping motor and a stepping motor? I have no idea, but the performance is basically identical to what I've seen from their DSM-equipped lenses. Initially, I did have a few firmware quirks that I had to report back to Yongnuo, but remember, I'm reviewing a pre-release copy of the lens. They were able to do a firmware update that fortunately solved all of those issues, and so now autofocus is really quite good. And so that means quite good speed, front and back, no issues with that. I had good precision overall, no problem locking onto subjects and getting, definite, well-focused results. Overall, speed performance is fine. It's quiet. It's accurate. It's good. No reservations there. On the video side of things, again, the same firmware update helped to iron out some tweaks or some concerns that I was having, some bugs with the autofocus there. And so before I was having a little bit of issue with focus pulls, but now, as you can see, they move seamlessly back and forth. No hesitation, no visible steps, all good on that front. There is some very minor focus breathing, but nothing excessive there, and so about, I would say, typical or average for lenses in this class. I also found that my hand test went fine with good transitions from my hand to my eye and back and forth. And so in general, I would say that Video AF was fine and did all that I wanted it to, and so no concerns there on that front. So let's take a look at the optics, and I'll give you an overview here. For those of you that want more information, I will have my deep dive kind of optical examination at the end of the video. This is an optical design of 10 elements in 9 groups. I don't know the breakdown of what elements are there. I know that there's at least some aspherical, at least a aspherical elements, maybe more, because there is aspherical as a part of the design there. I will say that, it's a two-edged sword when it comes to using the art name. Yes, you can maybe take some of the credit or some of the brand recognition that Sigma has created through consistently delivering very strong optical designs under the art brand. But it also means that when I see that word art, I also am going to expect more in terms of the optical performance. It means I evaluate a little more carefully in regards to that. I will say, however, that this lens mostly survives that critiquing. The MTF, as you can see, it looks quite consistently good. Very linear across the frame and only a minor amount of drop off towards the corners. That's a great looking MTF chart. One area of clear improvement over their Commander series lenses, all of those lenses did suffer from some chromatic aberrations, and I found that I could definitely see some fringing, longitudinal style chromatic aberration before and after the plane of focus. You can see here in this comparison to the 33mm f1.4 just how much radically different the 35mm f1.8 from Yongnuo is. I did see a bit of lateral style chromatic aberrations near the corner of the frame. Nothing significant, nothing that I consider to be too much of an issue there, however. For those of you wondering how well this covers the full frame image circle, the answer is not very well. You might be able to get very slightly wider than the 35 millimeters or the 52.5 millimeters in terms of the crop factor on full frame. But I mean, you might be able to pull it back to maybe 45 millimeters, but not worth doing if you're looking for a secret full frame lens. Fortunately, these days, there's lots of great, inexpensive full frame lenses that you can choose from if that's what you're looking for. I did find that distortion was very low, no issue with that. I dialed in a +1 to correct the tiniest amount of barrel distortion, but you would never notice it. Vignette is about average, a +55 is what I dialed in, so near 2 stops of vignette in the extreme corners, nothing particularly heavy, nothing too bad there. I found that chart testing results, and this is at 26 megapixels on Sony, which is the current highest resolution available there, that it looks good. It's consistently good across the frame, and so I have no reservations about that. But what I did find, and that is that this Viltrox 35mm f1.7 Air Series lens, that it's just as good in terms of the optics. And so if this was to be some kind of next level performance, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, the Viltrox is a very good lens, but I wouldn't say that the Yongnuo is particularly better in any kind of category there. However, just moving away from the comparison, I would say that real-world results really were consistently great. And what kind of stood out to me is that the micro contrast is quite good. And so a lot of these inexpensive lenses, and this is a lens that will cost, they're telling me under $200 US, that a lot of these lenses, they don't hold up as well when you're looking at kind of at a pixel level and looking at areas of high contrast. A lot of times you'll see just some kind of haze around some of the textures. They're not able to just nail down that high level of acuity that I like to see on higher end lenses. This lens, however, is doing a really good job in those circumstances. Contrast holds up under careful examination, that micro contrast that I'm referring to there. You will see a little bit of boost at f2. It's primarily seen in the corners, and then just a little bit more as you stop down to f2.8 through f5.6 and up to f8, kind of your peak landscape apertures. You're able to get nice crisp landscape type results there at that point. In this case, it has a smaller minimum aperture than what I often see in these style lenses. Usually it's f16. This will go down to f22, but of course that means that there is more potential at f22 for diffraction as compared to f16. And so typically I try to use f11 as my cutoff point, and anything after that, you're getting diminishing returns. And so only do that if absolutely necessary. The bokeh quality was generally good, and so when I put it in advantageous situations, I feel like it rendered very nicely. In some situations where there was a more busy background and/or a lot of it falling in what I call the transition zone before everything is fully out of focus, I felt like there it felt more like a budget lens. It wasn't incredibly creamy in those situations. But of course, it is an APS-C lens with a maximum aperture of f1.8. So you can't expect, f1.2 type results, and we certainly don't get those. The flare was a mixed bag. Directionally into the sun, it did pretty good. Coatings held up pretty well. But what I noticed is if the sun was right out of frame, you get some of that flashing effect that could be quite disruptive to the image. And so you will have to be careful in your composition, just being aware of that. Another area where I did see some real improvement is that I suspect that this is using different optical glass than what we have seen in some of their previous lenses. Optical glass feels better. Colors are nicer. There's kind of a look that comes with some cheaper lenses where the colors, It's very hard to define, but there's just something about them that feels cheap. This doesn't fall into that category. Optical glass is better. It reminds me of the leap ahead that Viltrox has taken to where their optical glass is demonstrably better than what it was in their early years of lens development. And I feel like this lens is taking a similar leap there where the colors really look quite good. So my conclusion is that I definitely like the optical improvements, and I think that I will applaud Yongnuo for taking some steps in the right direction, controlling chromatic aberrations better, nicer optical glass, and just a generalized more punch to the images and the resolution. So all of that is good. I don't like the use of the art name, and I won't beleaguer that too much since I did hit it a lot in my opening, but I really wish that they would have come up with something unique to them that demonstrated that this was going to the next level of optical design, but not take something that has been uniquely Sigma's for over a decade at this point. And so anyway, I wish they hadn't done that. This is a very good lens in a lot of ways, and if you end up buying it, you're going to get a very, very nice lens. I think the challenge for Yongnuo is that the market, particularly over the last 2 years, has become very saturated. I've referred to the Viltrox, but into that space during that time, we've gotten lenses from TT Artisan, we've got lenses from 7 Artisans, not to mention the other players that were already in the market. There's just a lot of competition in that particular space and at these very common focal lengths. And so there's not necessarily a lot to set them apart from the competition. There's not more features. The optical performance is great, but as I said, I don't know that it's better than what the Viltrox's is. I will give you a detailed breakdown and head-to-head comparison with the Viltrox in a subsequent video, though it's going to be some weeks out just because my schedule is so full with new releases. But stay tuned for that. If you want more information in the meantime, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There's also some buying links there if you'd like to purchase one. Beyond that, if you want that deep dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. Let's jump into it together. So we'll start our examination by taking a look at full frame coverage. You can see that we have this hard mechanical vignette here, which shows that part of the image circle, full frame image circle, is just not being covered. Now, if we look at vignette distortion, we can see that there's a really minimal amount of distortion. I used a +1 to correct just a tiny bit of barrel distortion, corrected nice and linear, but I mean, in 99.9% of situations, you could leave that uncorrected and you wouldn't have any problem. Vignette is moderate. I used a +55 to correct here in the center. It did correct nice and clean, no odd discoloration left behind, and so nothing to worry about on that front. As I pointed out earlier, longitudinal style chromatic aberration has really been a bit of a bugaboo for Yongnuo lenses. We've really seen progress on that front here, and so there's minimal amounts of fringing before and after the plane of focus. That looks great, nice and clean. What that means is that in situations like this, where previous Yongnuo lenses would just show maybe some blooming on the textures, some loss of contrast, maybe some extra fringing in these high contrast areas, we can see here that we've got great micro contrast even at f1.8, and so it's a real improvement on that front. And as we look towards defocus, we can see there's maybe a tiny bit of fringing here, but for the most part there is just really minimal fringing in the image. When it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, you can see that there is a little bit as we get here towards the edge where you're getting some false color on the sides of the black and white there. Not necessarily a major issue in real world shooting, but certainly that is the area where there's more of that style fringing than there is of the longitudinal style. Now, when we get to resolution and contrast, this is 26 megapixels on Sony, which is the highest APS-C resolution currently available there. 200% magnification, so we can really see all the flaws here. Looking in the center of the frame, good detail and contrast there. Not off the charts contrast, but good, and a lot of crisp detail that's being shown there. Mid-frame is still looking very consistently good. No problems there, and as we move towards the edge, I like to look here and here. You can see that there's only minimal drop-off from this zone to this zone as we move towards the corner. And right here into the corners, we can still see a very decent amount of magnification. This is looking similar here on the left side, up into the left corner. Again, looking consistently good. Upper right corner also looking good. Good centering performance. So at 100% magnification with real-world shots, to put that into perspective, you can see there is lots of detail and very good contrast. It's holding up very well in this this image here, which allows you to have a very nice amount of detail. Even moving out towards infinity, where a lot of these lenses fall apart, these cheaper lenses like this, it actually looks really good. There's good detail and contrast there. It's, it's not the highest resolution that I've seen, but a very strong performance. And here at a little maybe more optimal zone here, shot of Nala, you can see there's great detail and contrast in the area of focus around the eyes, accurate focus there, and a pretty decent looking defocused background as well. So if we go from f1.8 to f2, we really don't see a marked difference. I think there's a little bit more contrast. Darks look a little bit darker there, but nothing that really stands out in terms of the resolution. But you can see again here in the hair that it's just there's more contrast that's available there. A little bit more contrast in the Canada. Here you can see it's just a little softer looking. And so there is a mild amount of improvement there in terms of contrast. However, you'll see a more marked improvement in contrast at f2.8, where all of the darks are starting to really darken up. And so you can see that the text is popping more. There's more detail there. If we look up into the upper left corner, we can see just a whole lot more contrast coming here. You can see that moire pattern starting to emerge because contrast is improved, and just a whole lot more delineation of detail in the hair here, in the text. It all is looking much better. Between f2.8 and f5.6, even here in the corner, you can see now that resolution is completely crisp all across the frame. Really great detail and contrast. Now you can see here that metering didn't remain flawless. That you can see it's overexposed a little bit here at smaller apertures, but we can also see that there is some effects of diffraction here. You can see that maybe the text there isn't quite as crisp, but I will say that even at f22, it really doesn't look too bad. And so I think that this is an image on this maybe lower resolution point here on Sony. You might see more diffraction if on a Fuji X mount, for example. But overall here, I would say the lens is holding up quite well even at small apertures. So as we talked about earlier, the maximum magnification is 0.12 times, which is not super high, but it's a usable amount. We can see that up-close performance, even at f1.8, is quite good, though. Good detail, good contrast, nothing to complain about there. Taking a look at a real-world shot at minimum focus distance, contrast looks great. I've shot this chess piece a lot, and I can tell you that this is holding up really well in terms of the overall contrast and detail. You can definitely see there's a pretty strong amount of the cat eye deformation kind of shape. And this is kind of the oddity here, is just this little kind of like cutout or clip that is there in those specular highlights. Just a little bit odd. We'll examine that a little bit closer here. You can see it just here at f1.8. Stopping down to f2, it's better, but there's still it's like the roundness is like a little bit lopsided in a bit, and we can see that even stopping down to f2.8, we never get quite a round shape. It's almost a little bit more of like a lemon shape. So I don't love the shape of the specular highlights, so maybe that not a strength necessarily. In this shot, great on the great front is the contrast and detail looks fantastic. I mean, that looks great. The bokeh looks, I think, fairly good, but it's not like super soft and creamy. This shot here, this is a pretty favorable ratio, so detail on the subject, contrast there looks good. The background looks pretty soft. Where there's more defined specular highlights, again, you're going to see those cat eye effects, a little bit more pronounced than what I would like. But in this zone, the bokeh is reasonably soft. This shot, again, a pretty good ratio and mostly soft rather than hard edges, and it looks, I would say pretty good overall. And this shot where we've got a little bit busier, I still like the look of the image here right now. This part looks great, obviously. In some of these busier things, though, you can see that it doesn't handle that transition zone super well. This shot, it's a lot of difficult background, and you can see it's not handling that very well. A lot of outlining. It just looks very, very busy to my eye. And this is kind of somewhere in between. It's not a super creamy or defocused background. So, I mean, it's a 35mm f1.8 lens, but I do think that the higher detail and contrast of the lens means that the out-of-focus backgrounds can also still have a little bit too much detail to them. And so that is a potential downside for the lens. Now, if you're shooting landscapes with this lens, it's great. I mean, great detail, great contrast. That's all going to play to its strengths. And so I think that it's going to handle this kind of image very well. And as noted, the optical glass is looking better. Flare resistance is only average at best. You can see here there is some loss of contrast. There is a little bit of a ghosting pattern. That's not too terrible. We can see here that you're going to get some ghosting if the sun is right in the frame and, and it's kind of going diagonally. However, if the sun is at other certain points, like kind of like right out of frame, you can see you get more strongly pronounced ghosting and definitely some veiling in this image as well. There's kind of like this whole zone where there's kind of a flare pattern. You're just going to have to be careful with composition. Coatings are not off the charts good. And so as you can see, this is a nice lens, not a flawless lens, but a very nice lens optically. So if you do choose to buy one, you're going to get very nice performance out of it. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.